This is NoWeedIllinois.com. I'm Monty Larrick. No Weed Illinois is opposed to the legalization of today's high-potency marijuana. State lawmakers could consider a legalization bill in January. We're urging the public to kindly ask their lawmakers to vote no on marijuana. You can contact your lawmakers at 217-782-2000. That's the state capitol switchboard. During this No Weed Illinois presentation, we're joined by Dr. Mourad Gabriel. Dr. Gabriel is co-founder of the Integral Ecology Research Center in California. He's the executive director and senior ecologist at the center. Dr. Gabriel is also a research associate faculty at One Health Institute, Wildlife Health Center at the University of California, Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. He knows what he's talking about. Dr. Gabriel, the chemicals being used to grow today's high-potency marijuana are killing wildlife and damaging the environment. Explain what's happening in California. Let's start out with the illegal marijuana plantations.
So in California, there's a large land base that is public land. So that's National Forest Service lands, BLM, also National Park Service lands and state park lands as well. A lot of the marijuana that's being currently cultivated is on these public lands. And as you mentioned, the chemicals that are being used either have been restricted for use by Federal Environmental Protection Agency or the state EPA, or actually banned for use because of the detrimental impacts to environmental and human health. Unfortunately, that's what we see continuously being used and applied at these marijuana cultivation sites on our public lands.
All right. We'll go into that a little bit more in depth throughout your presentation, but let's begin.
All right. Let me share my screen. All right. Can folks see that?
I'm seeing it now.
All right. Perfect. So what I will be discussing is the impacts associated with marijuana cultivation on public lands. But again, bear in mind that the majority of water, for like example, in California, 70% of California's water for municipalities comes from public lands. So even though this is impacting on federal lands, it still impacts many citizens in California. And also when I go through the chemical components of this, bear in mind that between 70 to upwards of 80% of marijuana cultivated on federal public lands is then shipped out to other states throughout the union.
Okay.
Right. So this is what, as stated, I'm a wildlife ecologist, a wildlife biologist, ecotoxicologist. This is what our institution, our organization used to do in the past. Collaring animals, doing molecular work, and going out there to find out life history traits, similar to what you would envision you see in the National Geographic or Smithsonian Institute research groups, where we're trying to find out where an animal lives throughout the landscape. And this is our co-director, Dr. Greta Wengert, who's here with a bobcat, and you can see a collar there. And we work with different partners, federal partners are in here, is various tribal entities to start tribal wildlife programs. And this is what our organization has done in the past. And it stems from this animal, which is the fisher. Folks in Illinois may be familiar with the fisher, just east of them, in Vermont, Minnesota, Wisconsin, New York, and Maine. The fisher is prolific in its populations, but here in California and the West Coast, the populations have dwindled down to some areas to only 150 to 300 animals. So the federal agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, listed the fisher as a candidate species, which is the protection under the Endangered Species Act. And this species is a remote forest species. So we're talking about something that lives deep in the remote forest, not associated with any human dwellings at all. Now, it was in 2009 where we started to have a fisher, we're determining what causes the mortality of fishers. So, was it hit by a car? Was it killed by a predator? It was in 2009 where we had this beautiful male die. You can see the collar around its neck, so we know when it died. We also knew where it lived. And this fisher lived in its entire life in Yosemite National Park as well as the Sierra National Forest. So it was a public land fisher. And we found out that the fisher died due to anticoagulant rodenticide toxicosis. So what that means is that fisher died from eating too much rat bait and basically died by bleeding out. So it could bleed out in its cavities or bleed out through its mouth or ears or eyes. And these are other examples.
Well, why are the growers using rat bait?
And so that's a great question. We didn't know it was growers at this point, well, until we started asking law enforcement officials. But when we were talking to growers now, rat bait is extensively used because it protects the plants from rodents that girdle plants. Because these plants, for their flowering products, pull a lot of sugars and the high sweet resin, sap, coming up in the water content, they'll go ahead and consume that. So in order to protect the plants, they have to kill the wildlife.
Wow. And this is a beautiful little creature we're talking about, this feature. My goodness.
It's a very majestic animal. So we published this paper, and you can see it's anticoagulant rodenticides. This is an open source peer-reviewed publication, so everything we do as a scientific research organization has to go through the scrutiny of peer-reviewed publications. These are on our website for folks to freely download, disseminate, and share as well, and as well as the photos are free to use as well to download.
What's the website?
Integral Ecology Research Center, so it's ecology.org.
Okay, what's that again, once again? I'm sorry.
It's IERC Ecology, all one word, .org.
Okay, thank you.
And so we had 4 fishers that died, and we had 79% of the fishers that we were testing exposed to rodenticides. Now, excuse me, when you think about 79%, when we first put this paper out, the reviewers came back and stated this is higher than the owls and hawks in New York City, Central Park. This is higher than coyotes or barn owls in downtown Los Angeles. There's no way fishers in remote forest settings are exposed at this level. Plus also having fishers exposed to not just one, but an average of 1.6 different rodenticides. So this is a clear illustration that we had a problem on our hands in our forest, in our public lands, and we were able to link it now in this paper to rodenticides that were being used at marijuana cultivation farms, or actually marijuana grow sites. So rodenticides, just primarily brief cursory look at them, are chemical pesticide. They're used legally for building agriculture and livestock to get rid of pests. They come in different pellets and flavorizers as well. Essentially what all of us with a vertebrate, so a backbone, have, we recycle vitamin K. And that's what this does. It disrupts the vitamin K, so it leads to coagulopathy or essentially bleeding out. Now with that,
well, that sounds like a horrible death.
it is. It's a very painful, and I have a video of a fisher actually dying from this as well.
Oh no.
And this is where people would use it outside of their home, but for us people were using it at marijuana cultivation sites. You have predators like a fisher, an owl, or a fox eating that prey item that's exposed. Then you have other predators that get it and get exposed in that way. And then you have scavengers then would be exposed through eating the dead animals. So as you can see, this is a legacy effect. So this chemical being used in these remote forest settings are a problem that will be contaminating the food web. So as I showed before, what we used to, and I kept on illustrating or stating that this is what we used to do. This is now, bear in mind, this is what we have to do now in order to collect data, not just on marijuana, but to collect data, anything pertaining to any wildlife species in the state of California. we have to be escorted by law enforcement because
my.
the growers out there are armed. There's millions of dollars of product they're out there to try to protect. There's a good example on the bottom photo where it's myself, Dr. Greta Wengert, Hoopa tribal biologist Mark Higley, and then you have the soldiers as well as law enforcement present, and the congressman from our state, U.S. Congressman Jared Huffman. They're all wearing bulletproof vests. That's the level of protection we have in order to enter our public lands in California.
So if just a private citizen wants to take a walk in the woods in California, they're putting their lives at risk?
I would say if they stayed on trail, that wouldn't be an issue, but if they were to go off trail, they should probably talk to law enforcement officials for that land management agency and ask them, is there any concerns of me going off trail here because, or, with marijuana cultivation? And they'll be honest, like, I would avoid this area because you will be running into individuals, just like if you were running into the border, that they're muling all this weed out to go out to cars and vehicles to be transported to states back east.
Well, who's running these illegal grow operations? We hear about Cuban interest and whatever. Who's involved in this?
The majority of individuals that law enforcement I've seen apprehended at these grow sites, because we go in, like in this example, we're going in on the entry date with law enforcement and they apprehend them. The majority are from south of the border, and out of those is probably about 95% are foreign citizens from Mexico. A lot of the pesticides we also find the majority of them are also smuggled pesticides from Mexico as well.
And these are cartel operations then?
That's something the law enforcement has stated, both cartel and non-cartel. I consider them they're drug trafficking organizations. They're highly organized. When you have a grow site that has tens or upwards of $100,000 worth of infrastructure, and then you're cultivating, a good example was earlier this week, we went to a grow site, I believe it was Monday and Tuesday, and they probably had upwards of $500,000 to $750,000 worth of marijuana product present, and that would be between 300 to 400 pounds of marijuana. And so you see that, and you just were to take that back east and say that's $2,000 to $4,000 per pound, you could see that how lucrative it is. And if that organization has 3 or 4 of these, you're talking about $3 to $4 million annually of income that they're using or obtaining through marijuana cultivation and bear in mind, this is just our public lands. We're not even dipping into the different drug trafficking organizations that are grossly overwhelming our private lands as well in California.
Let me ask you about that. Do some of these grow operations blend between public and private lands? They kind of intersect.
I've been to both factions of cultivation, and the private lands that are illegal, unpermitted, are choosing to be in the black market, not even wanting to participate in any state regulation or programs. There's no difference in regards to the people who are running these and the chemicals that we see and the amount of environmental impacts or firearms. So this is something I would state that there is a blend. It's very hard to distinguish between the two. The only way to distinguish some of these are just by who owns the land. But again, it's unfortunately in California, we have not tens of thousands, we may have upwards of 100,000 plus private cultivation parcels growing marijuana.
Oh my. Well, we probably need to move along here.
Yep, no worries. So that was our first paper, the 2012. We published another paper. So you could see it went from 79% to 85%. Instead of 4 fishers that died in just 2 years, we had a total of 9 additional fishers, so 13 fishers. Now, that may not seem like a lot to some folks, but bear in mind that we are looking at each and every fisher that died within the state of California, and to have 13 individuals, which totaled about 8 to 12% range of how many fishers were dying annually from this act of poisoning, that was a significant blow to this population as a conservation concern. Now, the next thing is, what's going on recently? So just of the January of 2017, so within 14 months, we've tested 26 fishers, and 100% of those are exposed to this rodenticide with 4 deaths. So if folks were to state, well, we have policy in place that has been protecting by regulating and legalizing marijuana, this data kind of refutes that, stating that we're not seeing a change in the black market aspect of it. We're seeing fishers being exposed and also killed associated with marijuana cultivation sites and their poisons at a higher rate than previously saw. Now, here's the video of a fisher being poisoned by rodenticide. Now, fishers are very agile, strong. They're related to wolverines. They're the only North American species that can kill porcupines. And now you have a fisher that is flopping around, poisoned, can barely walk. You can see it's just lethargic.
It's terrible.
And then we had to, unfortunately, euthanize this fisher just because it was suffering immensely.
Well, you touched on something, Doctor. Are the environmental problems associated with marijuana cultivation limited to illegal grow operations? Are legal grow operations impacting wildlife and damaging the environment as well?
Well, that's a great question. Unfortunately, legal grow operations are so minimal compared to the all private land. It's a fraction. So out of this, it's estimated somewhere between now, with more law enforcement and regulatory agencies coming online, that of all the private cultivation, somewhere between 5 to maybe upwards of 15% of all private land cultivation is now under compliance. That still leaves 95 to 85% of them that want to still stay in the black market. So
if Illinois decided to legalize recreational marijuana, the illegal operations are not going to go away.
It hasn't. California has had a quasi-legal approach since 1996 with Proposition 215 and then Senate Bill 420. And each time a policy comes in place, we get another pulse of green rush. People capitalizing on the lack of enforcement, the lack of government oversight on this market, and they overwhelm. So they saturate, overwhelm, and if you have 100 individuals doing bad, and you can only have the enforcement to check up on 10% of those, you're gonna squeak by if you don't get caught, and you're gonna make a lot of money, and that's what has happened in California.
Okay, I'm seeing a picture here of the fisher became the canary in the coal mine.
Exactly. So we went ahead and as I mentioned, fishers are dying, exposed. We wanted to see the environment, water, soil, plants. How about humans? How about the contamination and issues with community members and law enforcement? Now, with that, I'm a hunter. I hunt, and my family hunts, and we try to provide as much what we consider one of the best natural meats that you could provide is game species hunted off your public lands. We wanted to find out if these game species were contaminated. And you can see in this top photo is a sow bear, black bear, with her cub on those logs, rummaging through a grow site. And then you have a beautiful mule deer here that is also eating material and toxicants at the grow site. So what we wanted to see, we tested 22 hunter harvested deer in a remote portion of California. So we didn't want to get somebody who's just shooting a deer out of their backyard or on their property outside of town. We went to remote hunters to see if their meat was contaminated. We tested out of 22, one of the deer came back positive for pesticides. So now that hunter consumed contaminated game species. And he asked us the question of what do I do? And I said, well, you need to talk to your physician, because similar to a fisher, if a fisher eats contaminated prey, they can succumb to the clinical manifestations associated with anticoagulant rodenticides. Now, we tested one mountain quail that tested positive and one black bear that tested positive. So, I pose the question, is this now a human health concern? I think it's clear now that it is. You decide to go hunting and there's cultivation and people are using poisons out there, your deer, your bear, your upland game can be potentially contaminated. Now, folks may know about northern spotted owls. Back east is northern spotted owls led to the timber wars here in California, Oregon, and Washington. It's a federally listed species. So we wanted to see, is this federally listed species that people have spent millions of dollars, where it's estimated that each northern spotted owl is worth several $million worth of conservation funds. Is this being impacted? We published another paper. We found out that 70% of northern spotted owls tested positive for pesticides, and these pesticides and these owls were associated with marijuana cultivation. And this one specifically was not just marijuana cultivation on public lands, but we made inferences that there is the potential that private lands may be contributing to the contamination of this federally listed species. So you could see this is an issue now that's impacting federally listed species. Now, the next question is, what species are being killed? What chemicals are they using? What are the motives these growers are doing it, and how? We went to various grow sites throughout the state of California, and we found 90 dead animals. So only 54% locations we detected dead animals. And that may seem, well, we're not finding a lot, but bear in mind that these are finding dead, actually, carcasses in a grow site. Not that many people go hiking in the woods and find dead animals. So that means that there must be more mortality associated with these sites than what we know about, but because of the level of detection we're finding. But we had animals that were being shot. You can see here, beautiful deer. There's a black bear skull with a clear .40 caliber bullet that went right through its skull. Also animals that were suspected to be poisoning. There's Dr. Wengert sampling an animal. And then also animals that were confirmed to be poisoning. So here's a rabbit. I'm sampling a gray fox here that the growers poisoned intentionally and maliciously. Here's an example of how scary this situation is I'm going into a grow site to document the environmental impacts, and I find a dead gray fox with a turkey vulture nestled in the dead gray fox carcass. Now, many folks will know vultures will eat roadkill, dead, dying, sick animals. They're pretty much the garbage cleaners of the natural environment because they're immune to a lot of different items that they've evolved with to be able to consume this. But here's a turkey vulture that looked like it took one bite and died mid-bite on this gray fox. I went about a half a mile to another grow site, walking through the forest. We found another grow site. We found exactly the same thing. And the other thing is we found many dead flies that were landing on these carcasses and dying. And they were positive for a chemical called carbofuran. Carbofuran is, for all intents and purposes, illegal for use in the United States. It's banned from the European Union, in Canada, because of its high impact to the environment and human health. But the chemical, we find carbofuran, all of it, 100% of it, we find it's being smuggled from south of the border. They're bringing it here to cultivate and then poisoning our wildlife.
You mentioned that this vulture died mid-bite from one bite. That's how potent these toxic chemicals are.
They are. They're extremely potent. That if you can, when we go back, if you see I'm wearing butyl nitrile gloves, I'm wearing nitrile gloves under those butyl nitrile gloves. These are chemical resistant gloves that we purchased, and it's the same gloves that the military uses for chemical warfare. So we're protecting ourselves at that level because these are very potent. Carbofuran, a good example of carbofuran is it would take a quarter of a teaspoon of this material to kill a 600-pound male African lion. For you and I, it's probably going to take about a 1/16 of a teaspoon to kill one of us. That we find 1, 2, 3 bottles of this at a grow site. This year we found a grow site that had 9 bottles of it. So they use it proficiently and they use it extensively throughout a site. And here's a great example. You can see at the bottom of the plant, here's marijuana plants. And just to go back to carbofuran, it's a systemic insecticide, which means that you place it on a plant, the plant's going to suck it up and then place it into the trichomes and the resin. And to kill animals like mites that are damaging that plant. That's why people use it. But again, it stays in a plant for months or possibly, well, we've detected it in some areas, in some plant material for 3 or 4 months. So if people use it like in this manner, that means that harvestable product can be contaminated with this, and then an individual can potentially consume it or volatilize it and get exposure in that manner. But here you have this carbofuran there. Individuals, they're using toothbrushes, putting it on those plants, and at the bottom of these plants, this is what we find, dead animals, over and over again. So that's why they use this chemical as well to protect their plants.
Doctor, are the chemicals you're describing also being used in legal grow operations?
Yes. So this year, I've been fielding a lot of inquiries and assisting state agencies because they are finding these chemicals now in the private sector. Private sector, again, these are individuals that are going under the guise that we're private. We're applying for permits, but they haven't received a permit. They're not under some type of regulatory program. But yes, that is the case. The other issue too, just to make it clear with the audience, is the state of California does have a screening process for their regulated market. So that means if you bring a product in, it's supposed to be screened. But again, it goes back to they're not being surprise visited like FDA or food or someone from agriculture to come in to inspect meat processing. They're depending on the grower to submit samples to an independent lab, which some of these labs may have investments into the marijuana industry to then give them a clean bill of health to then sell, versus a government inspecting surprise visits. The other issue too is what we're finding is these organizations in the private sector as well as the public land sector are using chemicals that are not part of the screening process. So now you may have chemical A, B, and C that a grower is using, but the state of California is only screening for chemical A. So that means B and C chemicals can be used, can pass the scrutiny and the litmus test that the state of California is providing or recommending, and still hit a consumer. So unless the states have a very stringent and kinetic regulatory process for pesticides, we have to think about the black market will always try to circumvent this.
Yeah, I'm going to show my lack of knowledge on this, but is the marijuana that is being sold through legal operations, is it washed down before it's sold to the public, or what do they do?
Well, California, before July 1st, 2018, that's when they hit a second tier of testing. So they had a free-for-all, get rid of any product that you had on your shelves before we hit the testing. So that means that there could have been a lot of contaminated product that went out there. Now, what we've seen and heard is about 15 to 25% of current products out there are failing pesticide residue testing. That's California. If they're failing at that level, we suspect that there's probably other chemicals that the state of California is not testing for that can easily pass current California standards and regulations. And that's California alone. Other states don't have these stringent standards that California has, which means that contaminated product can easily hit these other states as well, and are most likely hitting these states because people have done independent testing on some products that are out in stores and find that they have failed for pesticide residual or solvent testing.
Well, before we move along here, I need to reintroduce you. And this is NoWeedIllinois.com, Monty Larrick here. And we are joined in this presentation by Dr. Mourad Gabriel. Dr. Gabriel, co-founder of the Integral Ecology Research Center in California. He's also the executive director and senior ecologist at the center. Doctor, let's move along.
All right. So as I mentioned, we wanted to find out why these growers were doing this poisoning for wildlife at these sites. And when they found out with some safety interviews I was able to perform with some of these individuals, they said that they find wildlife as nuisance, pests, or just food items, and sometimes they just shot them because they were bored. They also approached nuisance wildlife by shooting them again or placing poisons on marijuana plants to discourage browsing or browsing or grazing by deer or elk, or even bears. Bears would consume these plants as well, or they place it on raw food, and then as you can see in this lower shot with the cardboard, it's splattered with pink material. That was where we found raw meat that they dipped into the carbofuran and then placed it on the cardboard. So then we found dead bears nearby, 2 dead bears right next to this cardboard. They ate the raw meat and died instantaneously. And that happens a lot. So that's how the growers approached wildlife. We wanted to find out also what kind of chemicals the growers are using. We're talking about rodenticides earlier, and we're talking about carbofuran, but we wanted to find out really what's the load, how much chemicals is occurring per site, and in what quantities. So you can see here, this is per site. Bear in mind, this is only per site, 77 location. So each grow site we were finding was having over 1,268 different pounds of soluble fertilizer. Then you have concentrated liquid fertilizer. These are all of the insecticides being used, concentrated. This is again per site. And then how many rodenticides, the pounds of rodenticides, and then molluscicides for snail and slug bait. So bear in mind that if we're finding this per site, and we have hundreds, if not thousands of sites occurring in the state of California, this is how much chemicals that are being placed out on these lands that are basically contaminating the soil, contaminating the water, and then posing risk to not just to the environment, but communities and human health below these sites.
So marijuana is not an organic product.
No, definitely. I state that continuously, that I have yet to find a unpermitted or a trespass grow that is organic to date. So, what are the potential source points of these exposures? We've talked about trespass grows through this talk, but one of the things is the scientific documentation for private grows is lacking. If we were to look at just public land grows, our organization is the only organization that has compiled this level of documentation. For private land, there's no state agency or entity in academics or in a research group like ourselves to have actually documented the level that we have on private lands. Now, we did a pilot project and we looked at only 22 private lands, and we found out that over 13% of them had rodenticides, so that's the AR present. Now, when we're talking about private cultivation, how is legalization completely eliminating this? Well, you can see here, We have a county of only 90,000 people, so it's a very small county, rural, very rural. We're 4.5 hours away from San Francisco, which is the biggest town nearby, and then 3.5 hours from the nearest other town, which would be Reading. So we're very isolated up here. But in this area, we have upwards of 15,000 private parcel grows. This is as of January 2018, only 2,300 of those applied for permits. So that means 15% of 15,000 grows decide to apply for permits. So we're still talking, it's legal in California by January 2018. And only 90 of those 2,300 were approved. So 4% of those applicants were approved. That leaves over 12,000 growers that decided we're not even going to apply. We are going to be in the black market. So you could see legalization wasn't this panacea silver bullet that everybody was going to come in compliance. And the reason for a lot of this is because the state is being more reactive than proactive. The state agencies didn't have regulations in place, didn't have enough enforcement in place to allow that when when legalization were to occur, they were going to stop that black market. They're now being reactive. They're trying to play catch up, and it may take them years to play catch up.
And this should serve as a warning to Illinois lawmakers who are considering the legalization of this new era high potency marijuana.
Is if the state does not have protective measures in place, we always what's the adage of an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. It's the same thing. If they don't have the preventive measures in place, then I would tell any state agency or state that you will likely mimic what California is undergoing. So the next thing is there was a publication by some colleagues that wanted to look at is we have timber industry here. We wanted to see if all this private cultivation that's occurring in California, was it environmentally impactful compared to private timber? Remember, private timber was one of the reasons why the spotted owl was listed because of fragmentation. So in this photo, you can see these are all private timberland. This is a private forest that has been now converted into parcels for cultivation. All those little green dots are actually marijuana plants, and all that clear cutting is people who have cleared the land. They get rid of the timber, they don't sell it, they just throw it off to the wayside, and then they grow marijuana. So they compared this to timberlands, and if they said edge habitat proportionally was greater at private private cultivation versus private timberland clear cuts. So here, if you had a clear cut and we were to measure that edge along this, we may say that's 20 miles of edge of a big, huge clear cut on an area. But what's happening in private lands, they're doing micro cuts. So if each one is only 2 miles, people might say, well, it's a small little private cultivation. But if you have 30 of these, you have multiple, 15 of these, you're talking 30 miles. So you can see, again, going back to that previous slide, Humboldt County has 15,000 private cultivation sites. The state of California is estimated to be between 80 to over 100,000 private cultivation sites. It's now stating that this may be more detrimental than actually clear cutting our forest because it's death by 1,000 cuts.
Well, let me ask you, Doctor, will that land being used for marijuana be permanently scarred? Can it be reclaimed? Or are the chemicals being used in marijuana going to make that ground just barren wasteland?
We have yet to see. And what I would tell people is we need to look back at history. California is a great example. And the citizens in California, as well as the politicians in California, must reflect back on previous history where the gold rush occurred. We had a gold rush in the mid 1800s, we had a rush of people coming in from all parts of the Union, different countries coming in. And after these individuals came in and did this, now the next thing was they destroyed the environment by getting rid of soil, cutting lands, and you have 150 years post-gold rush, California is still spending millions of dollars to rectify these damages. 150 years post-gold rush. We have a green rush here in California where we have exactly the same. Here's a county, again, going back to Humboldt County. When I first moved up here almost 25 years ago, very rare to find plates from other states. It'd be maybe adjacent states. But on my daily commute, I find plates from Illinois, Wisconsin, Florida, New York, pretty much almost every state. We have individuals coming from all different parts of the world here. And the underlying theme is we are going to set up shop and grow marijuana and make money. It's exact parallels to the gold rush. We have this green rush, and are we going to be 150 years from now stating that we did not have preventive measures in place in order to protect the citizens of California, the citizens of the Union, as well as citizens throughout the world benefit from clean water, clean land, and air? Are we going to basically deal with these same ramifications like the gold rush? And I think we are mimicking it exactly. Now, here in this slide, it kind of, again, goes back to, we wanted to find out, is water or soil below these grow sites or within these grow sites contaminated? You have Dr. Wenger with some associates collecting some soil samples within a marijuana grow site. Then you have all these chemicals that they just toss in the creeks after growing, and we wanted to see how these waterways were, if they're contaminated. We started monitoring as a pilot project 14 grow site complexes, and 40% of the water samples below these grow sites were contaminated, not just with one, but two or more types of pesticides. We found carbofuran in these waterways. And again, bear in mind, carbofuran is for legal purposes banned from use. And we're finding it in some of these, unfortunately, waterways, in a couple of these areas. It was contaminated waterways that lead to people's houses and ranchers and municipalities. Soil, the soil is contaminated. 46% of the soil samples we tried to test came back positive. And unfortunately, we wanted to find out the longevity of this. So that's the next step we hope to take, is how long is these soil samples positive? For 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? Or are we going to deal with legacy impacts? Now, water use. People may think, it's a plant, you throw it in the ground, nothing, you don't need to take care of it. It's a weed. But bear in mind that marijuana is a thirsty plant. It takes 900 gallons per plant for a season to grow. So when we look at just
repeat that, doctor.
Again,
repeat that, doctor.
That is 900 gallons per plant for a 150-day growing season for that plant. That's how much water it needs to grow.
So when if you do the math,
that's these numbers.
That's a lot of water.
Oh yes, and so what I'm showing you here is just plants taken and removed off of National Forest Service lands. That's it. We're not talking private cultivation. You can see 2016 and 2017, we had 1.2 million plants being removed each of those years. That's 1.1 billion gallons of water that marijuana plants were using. This is how much water that was at a minimum being diverted to support plants. And that would be equivalent to the amount of water the city of San Francisco would use for 1 to 2 months. So you can see that's how much water is being stolen from our pristine waters in California just to support this plant. And it's being done illegally with no permits, nothing.
And you have water shortages in California.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Extreme water shortages in areas here. And so now that is a very conservative estimate, what I mentioned, but when you go out to a grow site, this is what you find. You find charged water lines year round. This is in December. And so this is the grow season's over with. We go out and we find all these lines. We start to remove these lines, and this is how much water is being taken. 7 lines charged, 8 gallons per minute per line, over 3,000 per hour. You total that per year, this one grow site was just poaching over 29 million gallons a year. Now that's one grow site. Now bear in mind that one grow site on public lands, but there's thousands of grow sites on public lands each and every. So when we said 1.1 billion gallons, that may be double or triple that amount of how much water is being stolen just on public lands. Now we talked to private lands, those estimates haven't even been calculated, and it's probably likely to surpass that. Now, finally, go ahead.
Do legal grow operations use that much water?
Yes, they do. And the operators there will dam creeks. The operators there will also, again, legal operators, there's a clear line. There's legal operators that have gone through the scrutiny, had site visits and permits, and that's a rare portion of what California.
Okay.
Even though we've legalized it, recreational action. Now, the majority of it are still private lands who they may think that they're legal, but there really are illegal operations with no permits. And those individuals definitely dammed creeks, poach water sources, contaminate water sources. That happens extensively. Now, we're talking about all of these problems. We look at these are some solutions and some successes. The focus areas that we try to, so this is where we see that these are great mechanisms to offset these environmental impacts. Interdicting it before it establishes on private or public lands to make sure that people are in compliance, or on public lands, no one is going to do this type of activity, but also supporting law enforcement to disrupt these sites. As I mentioned, both on public and private lands, there's non-sufficient support for law enforcement to then tackle the black market on this. They're being more reactive. Then the other thing is information and education. One of the key things is informing and educating policymakers, agency personnel, and public and media of the scientific data that's out there. Not making decisions based off of sensationalism or emotionally charged topic, but more using science-based inferences to make these decisions. And for policymakers, agency personnel, public or media personnel as well. So one of the things we do show is that when you clean up a grow site, there's 0% reoccupation. So we've cleaned up, our organization has assisted or led in cleaning up of 180 grow sites. You can see in this photo, you see the right photo, that's how much irrigation line is being used to completely drain a creek. And all of that line is going out, and we're cleaning up these grow sites, and we have 0% reoccupation. So if you clean up the infrastructure, these growers don't come back. It's too cost prohibitive for them to go back and reestablish. Unfortunately,
you're cleaning up the grow sites, but there's got to be some pushback there too, I would imagine.
There is. Well, there is actually, just FYI, all the cleaning up of these grow sites is 100%. There's no streamlined funding at all to clean up these grow sites. So it's year by year how much grant money we are able to obtain to clean up these grow sites. Now, public lands, there isn't that much pushback because everybody's supportive of that, but on private land, cleaning up on these grow sites, folks, again, would look at this, and what we've heard over and over again is this is a waste of time and resources, and the private cultivators should be responsible for this, but unfortunately, these are drug trafficking organizations. It's very hard for a lot of law enforcement to find who is culpable for this this damage. And so a lot of these private lands that have been eradicated and damaged, the chemicals and the irrigation and the poaching of water still occurs and still is occurring. So unfortunately, there is no remedy. Again, this is this reactive approach versus agencies being proactive and having mechanisms in place before policy is taken forward. Now, here's a good example, a video of what a grow site. Here's a grow site, 15,000 plants, all in a clear-cutted portion of the forest. Here is how much trash is left behind. The creek is 100% diverted. No water in this creek, chemicals, everything is placed in here. You have bears coming into this grow site, eating the food, sleeping. They're comfortable, just sleeping in trash and chemicals. There's a bear coming up to, in that same grow site, bottle of carbofuran. And then we also, that's what we do. We want to leave it back to its natural state. So we clean up these grow sites. And look at the pipe. Just from one grow site, that's how much pipe we remove. And so these are what I look at as successes, but unfortunately it's grant-based. There's no steady streamline of approach to this. So next year, if there's no funding available, there may not be any grow sites to be cleaned up, and it all stays in place. So I know there was a lot of slides here.
Doctor, I imagine there are some people out there who are concerned about that and your funding for this. Is there something they can do?
Yes, I would say letting policymakers, if there is something to be in place, letting policymakers know that there needs to be funding set aside to offset these environmental impacts associated with the black market or even legal markets. There's always an issue that some of them may not be in compliance and they are damaging the environment. In addition to that, for our organization, we are about 99% supported through grants. We rarely receive donations, and that is one other mechanism. But I've encouraged, and it has not happened yet, but I've encouraged even the cannabis industry, the marijuana industry, that, hey, if you are very vested into the benefits of the state of California and the environmental impacts, support cleanup operations. We yet have to see $1 occur from that, but I'm always optimistic. At one point, the marijuana industry may be supportive of that. They may voice it, but we haven't had yet support or seen support to actually physically see it being done.
Well, Doctor, let me ask you this. Do the environmental costs in California offset the tax revenue being generated from legal marijuana sales?
I don't know the specifics if it is 100% being offset, but I can state that California's revenue from the sales is far below what they expected, and I believe the first and second quarter. And so there's concerns whether or not there's going to be sufficient funding to offset these environmental impacts. But I would say just on public lands alone, we're talking of upwards, if we were to clean up all the trash, if growing were to stop yesterday and there's no more cultivation ever to occur on public lands, it will cost between $250 and estimated up to $500 million just to clean up all the grow sites on public lands. Now, that's public lands, which are in number smaller than the private illegal detrimental grows. So if we're talking about $250 to $500 million just to do that offset, you're talking about probably equally or more amount of money just to be offsetting the private industry. And that's just cleaning up. We're not talking about enforcement. So you could see that there needs to be a lot of tax revenue to be generated from that. But there's concerns, and I've heard concerns that lottery hasn't really built that many schools or helped that many schools. The offset from taxes from tobacco use also hasn't really supported as what people propose. So I say to folks, think about currently is the preventive measures in place to protect not only the environment but also the community before laws are enacted.
Well, Doctor, we're running out of time, but I'd like to ask you this question. And if you could just describe your experience. First of all, did you ever think, have the idea that your efforts to protect wildlife would put you in the middle of the drug war?
I never, no, absolutely not. I should have probably prefaced this in the beginning of the talk is I did not get my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, or PhD ever thinking that I would be working on anything that deals with marijuana. But I look at it as whether it's marijuana or whether it's, rhino horn poaching or elephant tusk poaching, I look at it in this manner. If there is an activity or an action that is extremely detrimental to the health of the environment, and as a one health individual too, looking holistically of health, not just in the environment, but also other members of the community, which includes humans, that's where my goal and my pursuit and my research portfolio and focus is going to be on. So no, I did not envision that, but naturally I see it. Now I am focusing on that. What I feel is an emerging threat to wildlife, the environment, and human health within the United States.
Well, Doctor, I'd like to thank you for having the courage to speak out on this. I know that because of your activity and your efforts to curb these illegal operations and what have you, you've been threatened, and your family as well. Tell us about that.
It was in the beginning, and there's been minor threats since then, but in the beginning, we tried to be silenced. Our research was there was an attempt to silence our research by individuals that came to our personal residence and threw poisoned meat with rodenticide. So it was meat that was poisoned with rodenticide, and it killed one of our family pets and exposed our other family pet that we were able to save. But it was a direct threat. I mean, that was a message and it was with a specific rodenticide we were talking about. And so it was a message that, you need to stop your research. And on top of that, the other issue that we saw was, there was threats. People have voiced their concerns. People have stated that they posted our residence lat longs or our location. They posted photos of our pets, children. And so this is something that I look at is we must be doing something good, because if there's a lot of pushback from a specific faction that is supporting this, then we must be hitting something that is truthful, and they're trying to silence the truth. And that's all we're saying is we're presenting scientific truth. And if people are trying to push that back, then they're not factually based. 1 + 1 will always equal 2. And if they're against that, and it's an illogical notion that us as scientists will go forward and push forward to try to rectify that.
Doctor, as we wrap up here, I'd like to get your opinion. What should voters who care about the environment, wildlife, and their kids tell state lawmakers who are considering legislation that would legalize today's high-potency marijuana?
Well, I would ask and encourage them to ask questions, just like a scientist would ask questions, is what preventive measures are you doing to, let's say, the plant material, to screen to make sure there's no pesticides, solvents? Are you on the regulated product that's out there? Do you have those in place? are you trusting the growers to submit their samples independently to an independent lab with no oversight and just providing a piece of paper to the agency? We wouldn't ask that at all from somebody who's going to provide meat on our tables. We want some oversight on that. Are you ensuring that these sites are going to be protected from theft? How about the environment? Is anybody going to go physically out there to see where their water is going to be used? If they're doing hydroponics and they're using all the soluble fertilizers and liquid fertilizers, are these hydroponic places going to post all of this high nutrient-based water into the municipality waterways? Is that going to add to eutrophication issues to Illinois' waters, where you have algal blooms in the summertime exacerbated by this pulse of nutrient-rich water? These are old questions to ask. What are you going to do to ensure the environment, the humans that are living within this environment, within your state, are protected and not being reactive to, oh, we should have had these protective measures. We apologize. We'll try to rectify these now. But that's, again, going to cost twice as much to rectify a problem versus a fraction of the cost to actually have preventive measures in place.
Dr. Gabriel, thank you so much. If folks have more questions, do you have some contact information that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I would say reach me on an email if you have any questions. The other issue is if you have any questions or would like any further information, our website is available. You can download all of our papers. You can also look at other videos that focus specifically on this or various notions. The videos that you saw here on this presentation are also free to download and free to use on our YouTube site. We are open access, which means that anything we create is for folks to download and share amongst yourselves and others.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate that.
No worries.
And Doctor, we appreciate your passion and the work you're doing. Dr. Mourad Gabriel, Dr. Gabriel, co-founder of the Integral Ecology Research Center in California. He's the executive director and senior ecologist at the center. God bless you and your work, Doctor, and thank you again.
All right, thank you.
All right. And thank you, folks, for tuning in. Remember, Illinois lawmakers could act on marijuana legislation possibly as early as January. Be in contact with your lawmakers. Ask them to vote no on the legalization of today's high-potency marijuana. The state capitol switchboard number for your lawmaker is 217-782-2000. Till next time, God bless.